And I've had him on. We've spoken about it. I've lectured about it. You end up making into my lecture
Oh,
because,
thank you.
yeah, well, I'm going to let you tell the story. Someone from afar, if they were an alien, they came down and all they were told was that you were brought in to investigate originally the ethics of the work that he did in this book. And I'll let you tell the story. But I think an alien would go, all right, sounds pretty simple. She'll decide, was he ethical, were there issues, and so on. And this has just become. I'll let
Never
you
that
tell.
simple. Yeah, no, I wasn't brought in. What
Oh,
happened was I was wrapping up about 10 years of intersex rights work, and I just taken a position at Northwestern's medical school,
okay.
a part-time long-distance position, because I'd given up tenure to do intersex rights work and do mainstream writing and that kind of thing. And so Mike and I had never met, and we had have a mutual friend, Paul Vasey, who's a sex researcher at Lethbridge, University of Lethbridge in Canada. And Paul's attitude was that I should look at what had happened at Bailey at the hands of a bunch of transgender activists. And I was very disinterested for a while because what had happened with Bailey was this huge blow up over his book in 2003. And various people that I knew who were transgender activists, I knew through my intersex work, had gone after him. Some of them had stayed very quiet. It was ugly. And so I pretty much stayed away from it because it wasn't my area and I wasn't interested. And also I figured Mike was probably the typical white male, straight, privileged clod who just didn't understand how offensive he was, because I had met plenty of scientists, and he is, by the way. I had met plenty of scientists like that. So Paul introduced us, and I started asking Mike all of the most controversial things because I have no tact. And so I was asking him things like, is it true that you slept with a transgender woman when she was your research subject? Is it true you studied people without institutional review board, ethics board approval? And he was very hostile, but was answering my questions. And what made me fascinated was that his interaction with Paul was so warm. We happened to be out at dinner at Boys Town in Chicago, which is the gay neighborhood. And Mike was completely relaxed with all the gayness and the gender variety around us. And so he didn't strike me as somebody who was like what I was picturing, which was a guy who was uptight about gender. And I had reread his book by that point. I was also confused because his book is so different from everything that was out there. It still is so different. It is very blunt and very rigid in some ways about gender and sexual orientation, but very much about the rights of people also who are
Right.
LGBT being honored. So it's this weird kind of libertarian approach to science. That's this attitude of we should not be afraid of whatever we find, no matter how offensive it is, but we should give everybody their rights. And so it was very disorienting as a book. So what happened was a few months later, Mike wrote to me and said that this person had been invited to Northwestern's campus. Her name was Andrea James, and she was one of the people who'd gone after him.
Yes.
And I hadn't sorted out who was who in his controversy, so I asked him, who is this? And he sent me back the stuff she had done to him. And in particular, the pictures she had put up of his children blacking out their eyes,
Right.
making the claim underneath that their father may have sodomized them. And really, as a person who has a kid and who does controversial work, it really scared me because I thought, well, this is just out of line, right? Go after people, but you don't go after their kids. So I ended up writing to the Northwestern group that had invited her, which was the Rainbow Coalition, and saying, I don't think this person should have been invited. Like, she is not good for trans rights, and she's not good for scholarship. She's out of line. And they didn't answer me. So I ended up blogging on it, actually on Mother's Day, ironically. And it was a blog called The Blog I Write in Fear, because I figured she'd turn her nastiness on me, which she did. But
Of
that only
course.
made me more interested because I thought, I got this flood of mail. Some of them was from transgender women who said they'd been attacked by her. Others said Bailey was out of line. I got stuff from Bailey's colleagues, some of whom said he was completely wronged, others of whom said the guy's a jerk. I got so many different viewpoints. And then I got mail from his daughter, who Andrea James had claimed he was estranged from his family, but his daughter sent me this very warm message saying, thank you for standing up to that awful person. So I was totally intrigued as a historian, right? Because this is so weird. You walk in, it's like a Jane Austen novel, right? You walk in and you don't know who, you've heard all these things, but you don't know whose character is what.
Right.
So I decided to look into it and to take it on as a historical project to try to sort out what the claims had been about Bailey and whether or not they were true. And I'm primarily a historian, but I wander into ethics. And so this was very logical for my field. And it ended up taking me about a year, and I worked with about 1,000 textual sources and video sources and interviewing about 100 people, some of them just very short interviews, but triangulating it all together and producing this very long article in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. I think it was as long as the last book I had published before that. And it tracked out exactly what had happened in the Bailey book controversy, basically showing that all of the charges made against him were not only false, but that the people making the charges would have known that they were false, and that they were doing this in order to stop him from purveying a message that for some of them was very offensive. And that was the message of autogynephilia. And I don't know if you want to get into that now, or if you've already done that in another conversation.
I did, but I was going to ask you about that because I still to this day, and I talked with J. Michael Bailey about this, I talked with Dr. James Cantor about this, and this is, I think, what really ticked a lot of people off, this taxonomy that if you're transgender, you're either autogynephilic or autoandrophilic, or you're an extreme homosexual, and you just took it to the next level. And, there's nothing
about... For the males.
For the males, right, yes.
Who become women.
Who become women, yes. And I was asking each of them, Dr. Cantor and Dr. Bailey, I was saying, but do you not have any space thinking that there are people who just say, you know what, it's not about sex, it's not about fetish, it's not about any of that, it's just simply, I feel I was born in the wrong body, and that's it. Nothing else sexualized. And they both say, no, the research shows it's one or the other. They both believe. Do you believe that there's that third category? Those are the people I come across as far as with my students and patients. What are your thoughts on that?
So I want to draw on what I learned from my friend Kira Tria, who was a person born intersex. So her history was really interesting. She was a typical female fetus, but her mother was given progestin to try to prevent miscarriage. And they didn't realize at the time that progestin could cause female fetuses to virilize. So when Kira was born, she looked like a boy, and everybody assumed she was a boy, but she was an extremely femme boy and into boys sexually. And she ended up in the clinic of John Money, actually, and they realized that she was in fact intersex, that externally she looked male, but internally she had ovaries and uterus, and her brain had probably developed somewhere in between, but it seemed to be mostly a more female typical brain. So they tried to make her more male because she challenged Money's theory. Money's theory was that gender is all about nurture, not about nature. And here Kira was this extremely femme boy. And so they tried shooting her with testosterone, which just made her hornier. It didn't change her orientation or her gender. It just made her horny, which is what testosterone will do for you. Right. And they finally decided to let her be a girl. So she had externals, essentially sex change surgery. So she essentially was both intersex and transgender, as a few intersex people are, because they reject their gender assignment at birth. And she ended up getting caught in this also because she felt that she was a sort of classic one of the type that we were talking about. She was what was called a trans kid, or what Blanchard called a homosexual transsexual, which was a person who was a very femme boy who was attracted to males and who grew up to be a woman. So she had sort of had that experience, although by way of intersex. And one of the things she helped me see was that if the issue of transgender was never about sexuality, then you wouldn't bother to change your genitals. So in other words, your genitals are really mostly for sexual pleasure. And the reason some folks need to change them is because they're the wrong type for the type of sexual pleasure they're seeking, the sexual pleasure that they need. So there are some transgender folks who opt not to change their genitals. And I think for them, maybe it's a little bit less about sexuality, or their sexuality is more complicated than these simple categories. But for a lot of the males who become female, if they undergo sexual surgeries, so they're changing their tops, for example, getting breasts, changing their bottoms, changing from a male anatomy to a female anatomy, that's generally done because of a sexual orientation. Now, you could say they're doing it because at the gym or in the bathrooms in North Carolina, they have to do it to pass. And there is an element of that some folks do it in part because you have survived by passing. But for some folks, it's done because it helps promote the sexual life that they want. And I think the problem is that we think that that's a shameful thing. Historically speaking, we've acted like the only way we can accept transgender is if it's about gender and not about sex, because sex is shameful. And so we can't possibly accept transgender people who transition because it has something to do with their sexual orientation, because then it would be about sex, and sex is not supposed to be something we're okay with. My feeling is when we finally reach the Enlightenment, we will be at the point where we recognize that some of the folks changing their bodies are doing it for sexuality reasons. And that's perfectly okay.
Sure.
It's right. Perfectly fine to be doing that. In the same way some people do body piercing or body tattooing or body augmentation or whatever it is, that this is one of those things that happens, and we don't need to feel shame around it. Right. I do think that Blanchard's taxonomy into these two types. The data suggests to me strongly that they exist, but also my own personal experience is that many people everybody who I meet fits those categories. Almost all the transgender women I meet fit logically the demographic of what Blanchard is describing when he's talking about autogynephilia. And I'll tell you over and over and over again, I meet transgender women who say to me, I don't like Bailey's book. I don't like the way this all went. Yeah, I'm autogynephilic, but I don't like any of it. And I try to engage them in the conversation and say, I don't think there's anything wrong with being autogynephilic anymore. None of us pick what turns us on. We're pretty clear about that at this point in history. People don't get to choose what turns them on. So it's fine. But many of them will say to me, that they don't like the way Bailey put it out there because he put out a very extremist portrait of autogynephilia, the image of Celtica, which is a very, having sex with robots and very sort of intense pornography, etc. He put forth a very rough image of autogynephilia. And so if that had not been the world introduction to it, it might have rolled out in a way that was smoother. The other thing is Blanchard, when he was developing the term and developing the concept or presenting the concept, he was doing so for what he thought was a purely clinical audience. He was not writing in a way that was meant to enter into pop culture. This was in the 1980s when people didn't have easy access to the medical literature, and most people were not reading the medical literature. So he's told me repeatedly that if he had to do it again today, he would probably do it in a slightly different way to make it sound less cold and less clinical and more like, this is one of those identities that can exist out there. And for some folks, transition will help them. It'll help them sexually, it'll help them psychologically, it'll help them socially. And Blanchard and Bailey have, for that reason, both supported public funding of transgender interventions because they believe it helps people. If somebody is well screened and she knows what she's doing, she should have access to it and be supported in it.
All right, and I'll be talking to Dr. Blanchard probably next week.
Great, excellent.
I'm going to look like a one-trick pony here because it's not about this. I'm trying to get people who deal with controversial, challenging issues that are far from unequivocal, and we need people to look into this. I mean, at least, with Dr. Cantor, I had pedophilia, so hey, I'm branching out, but because it's again, as soon as you wade into these areas, people just want to, for whatever reason, I think it's mostly fear-based, but they just want to portray such individuals as having, as I said earlier, these motives, these terrible motives, or being these terrible people. And ironically, some of the people who are being blasted the most are the strongest advocates.
And that's one of the things that fascinated me about that whole controversy was that once I started talking to Blanchard and talking to Cantor and talking to Bailey and talking to Ann Lawrence, it became clear to me that these are people who are very pro-transgender rights, that they were absolutely in support of transition for people for whom it looked like it would help. That their attitude was, for some folks, it probably wouldn't help, and we needed to be very clear with those people that what they were seeking was not possible. So, for example, for somebody who seeks to magically have a truly female body, it's not going to happen if you were born male. You can have an approximation, but you're going to have sexual tissue taken away from you, that sensitive tissue. You're going to lose your endogenous hormones, which means you're going to have to be on hormone therapy for the rest of your life, which is not insignificant to manage in terms of the way it makes you feel, right, and also just getting access medically to it in some places like the U.S. where it's harder to get access. So their feeling is, we need to be realistic about it, but also very supportive. And that surprised me because I had heard about all of these people, that they were the type of people who were trying to stop the recognition of transgender rights, that they were trying to get in the way. And, as a historian, those complicated characters are the most interesting characters because they're far more interesting than the good-evil approach. And I would say the same thing, by the way, for the detractors, for the attackers against Bailey, that those were women who genuinely felt that what Bailey had said about them was damaging to their self-identities and to their social identities. And they were going after him for full force because they were scared. They were worried about what it would do to them personally. And I get that. These were people who were motivated by, I think, genuine discomfort and genuine fear. That said, I think, as I showed in the article and ultimately showed in the book, Galileo's Middle Finger, they'd also pretty much admitted that they were autogynephilic in their own writing. And so the denial of it was essentially just a denial done for the sake of making things simple. And in fact, it wasn't simple. They themselves had written about themselves as being autogynephilic.
Right. And so I'll go back to my question. So do you believe then that taxonomy does cover all transgender people, or the vast majority? That is, one, or at least for males?
Women.
Yes, sorry, men who
Women.
yes.
No, and I think if you pushed Blanchard and Bailey, they would say the same thing. There are some folks that for whom there may be, small categories. For example, and I'm sure I'm going to offend somebody by saying this, there are some people who have psychosis, who identify that psychosis as attaching to transgender. And what's going on for them is not any kind of conventional transgender. It's just that they have a mental health problem that is manifesting itself in that way. That's not true for the vast majority of transgender people, but there will be a few people like that. And it's part of the reason why screening needs to happen, because just sending everybody down the line of go ahead, oh, you've decided you have a gender issue, therefore you're transgender, doesn't actually address folks' underlying mental health needs. Right. And for some folks, those will be very vivid needs. And for some folks, much less, that transition can go quickly and not be a big deal.
Right. I meant that another category of people who, do not have a mental health issue in that regard, but they just truly feel they were born in the wrong body. And that's...
I don't see evidence for that. And the other thing that strikes me is we don't see that with other types of human identity. So we don't, for example, see people who are singletons saying, I was meant to be a conjoined twin. We don't see people saying, I was meant to be a dwarf. We don't even see people who are dwarfs saying, I was meant to be a tall person. They may seek limb lengthening surgeries, but they don't tell this narrative of, I should have been born tall. I was born into the wrong body. So for that narrative, it would have to be such an exquisitely unusual narrative in terms of this particular anatomy and identity issue that it strikes me as unlikely. And what's going on is a very reasonable pragmatism that says my life will be easier if I live this way in this social category as opposed to this social category. And a friend of mine who's a transgender woman explained that to me many years ago when I said to her, I don't know what it means when a transgender person says, I feel like I'm really a woman, because I don't know what it feels like to really be a woman. And she said to me, Alice, I don't know what that would mean either. Here's what I do know. When I present in the world as a woman, the interactions I'm having with people feels right. And when I'm presenting myself as a man, the interactions I'm having with people feels kind of like they're looking behind me or to the side of me, and we're not connecting. And that to me made total sense, because there have been times in my life where I've occasionally had short hair and been grungy and I've been mistaken for a man. And it doesn't offend me, but it doesn't feel quite right. It feels like, wait a minute, this person doesn't exactly see who I am. And so that explanation made a lot more sense to me. So I think that the narrative of trapped in the wrong body is a narrative that has been offered because it makes straight people who are cisgendered comfortable. It's not because it's the right narrative. It's because it's the narrative that gets people their rights. And I would rather have the more complicated narrative, which is this body or this social identity is not working as well for me as this other one would work for me. And that, to me, that pragmatic approach is ultimately, I think, where we're going to go and say, what's the best we can do for you in terms of your own life? Mm-hmm. And you won't have to tell this story about this origin story that I think a lot of people may feel, but it's an origin story that is pretty oppressive, that insists you had to have known from the second you had consciousness that this was the wrong body. We just don't see it in any other. I mean, occasionally you hear a case report of somebody who feels that they should have been born. It's going to offend somebody for me even to say it. Occasionally you'll find a case report of somebody says they should have been born a cat, right?
Right.
And they'll seek interventions to change their body to be more cat-like. Right. And they will dress as a cat and they will behave as a cat. But that is so incredibly rare. And in that case, I think just off psychologically, that it doesn't make sense to me that in the case of gender, we would find this extraordinary situation. So if you talk with people who are Black, for example, you don't find them saying, I was meant to be born in a white body. You will hear them saying, I deserve my rights. I deserve to be treated as a human and not discriminated against. But they won't tell that same narrative. And it strikes me as very unlikely that gender is so extraordinary. On the other hand, gender is about sex, and sex is extraordinary in the human life, in evolution. So maybe it's true. I don't know. Well, I have more humility and more questions, frankly, than the guys do on this one. But I think that's probably because I think they don't understand female sexuality. So they think they do, and They don't, because it's really complicated. So.
Right. Well, yeah, actually, when I was talking to Dr. Cantor about that, he was saying, because he was talking more about, again, about this autogynephilic category. I'll link to the video, but he's talking about how he believes it's all about mirror neurons gone awry. It made perfect sense when he said it. It was so simple, and he said, "Oh, okay, I can see that." But what we were saying was, but what about my patients and again students who I think give them a polygraph test and they may pass when they say this is really, again, it's not about sex, whatever. It's true. I felt, as you were talking about, they actually would say though, I felt I was born in the wrong body from as young as I can remember, or at least when I started to understand about about genders and so on. And what he said was, it's not about trying to explain to other people. It's just the way that they are trying to make sense of their experience. And, so whatever is going on in the brain, it's just like with dreams. You might have a whole bunch of random neuronal firings, and somehow we make sense of this.
Yeah.
Right. So it's possible that that's how they perceive it. They're not lying to themselves. They're not lying to other people. Right. But that really underneath all that is this autogynephilic push. It would make sense that if you don't connect to that, you don't identify that, but that's what's going on. Hey, that's how you're interpreting it. It's like experience with the bridge in Vancouver that I done many years ago, where people walking across a bridge.
I don't know this one. That sounds fascinating.
Oh, it's cool stuff I've done many years ago. Yeah, so people would walk across a bridge, this really scary suspension bridge. They had this attractive female on one bridge and on another bridge, the other bridge not being some terrifying thing. And the people on the terrifying bridge were far more likely, I think, to reach out to her and try to contact her. And they were saying that those people, they misattributed the fear arousal to, sexual arousal. I must be interested in this woman. That's why my heart rate and everything. So
yeah, that's funny.
Right. So I can see a parallel where people, you're trying to make sense of your experience. So even if you don't know what's really going on,
things will, I think, get simpler when we begin to talk more about plain vanilla heterosexuality. And we haven't really done much on that because plain vanilla heterosexuality is very common, and therefore in a weird way it's kind of hard to study because you have to study it in comparison to something else. But I think as we begin to understand more about the ways in which our genders are tied up with our sexual orientations, then it won't look so strange when we look at autogynephilia or we look at what Blanchard calls homosexual transsexuals. We'll begin to understand that, for all of us, in fact, gender identity is tied up with sexual orientation. And I think you should talk to Blanchard about that because he and I have talked about a bunch, that I think the moments at which our gender identities, again, are the most vivid is the moment at which we're having a sexual experience. And that if that's true for people who are autogynephilic, it's as true for people who are plain vanilla heterosexual or plain vanilla homosexual or whatever we're talking about, that seems to be where gender sort of comes into the fore. And so there's nothing wrong with it for autogynephilia. And if it's the case that a person who was born male needs to transition to become a transgender woman because she feels that she's a lesbian, that she wants to be having sex with a woman as a woman, then if the origin of that is autogynephilia, I don't care, right? If that's the best thing for her, let's do it. And let's recognize that that's the best thing for her. And that's something that's going to make her sexual life better, her psychological life better, her social life better. She deserves that support.
So what about then people who say, and I lecture about this in my class as well, I've got my own take on this, people who say, look, we know the stats show that whether a person who transitions expressed their non-matching gender early in life, whether they were supported, whether they were not, whether they transition, whether they don't, they say the fact is stats with respect to suicidality, with depression, other mental health issues pretty much are the same. So they're saying surgery is irrelevant. These people have a mental health issue. Why are we encouraging surgery? Because that's not going to help them. They're still, there's something wrong. They have a mental health disease. What do you say to that?
What that suggests to me is that we are failing in terms of providing adequate support, but that doesn't tell me that the transition is failing. What that tells me is that we are probably spending a lot of energy on transition, but then not spending enough energy on the other issues that exist. So, for example, when you transition, that doesn't mean that you necessarily pass perfectly. So you may even be subject to more discrimination than you were before. You may be subject to breaks within your family, breaks within your friends by virtue of transition. So these are the kinds of things that don't magically get solved by transition, but that doesn't mean transition is the wrong choice. So I think we have to try to sort this stuff out and figure out, how to support people for whom we think transition is going to be best. We do now see retransition and detransition at rates we never saw before. And actually, some of the folks that would be interesting for you to talk to are the person who runs Third Way Trans and also Joel Nowak, who runs retransition.org. These are folks who are concerned with the general attitude that transition will magically solve everybody's problems,
Right.
because they feel that there's been sort of inadequate attention to appropriate care and also to screening to make sure people understand what transition will and won't do for them. And for some folks, in particular for folks who are not going to pass easily, transition may not be the best option for some of them. Some of them may elect to live part-time as men, part-time as women, for example, and that may be a better approach personally for them. It depends. Transition has been used largely because the straight population sees it as a sort of, everybody gets sorted out. Everybody ends up looking either male or female. We don't have to be disturbed. But for the actual population of people who have gender exploration or gender dysphoria or gender transition needs, there may be other options for some of them that will work better ultimately than others.
We're seeing more today than ever before. People, so forget transition, but people are saying, I'm gender queer, I'm non-binary gender, you know. What are your thoughts? I mean, to me, it's mostly anecdotal. Well, it's only anecdotal from what I've seen as far as on campuses. Do you believe that this is because the environment has been made such that people feel more comfortable being who they really are, which may be genderqueer, or is it because this is just, it's a trend, as people who are looking for any identity, whether it's that, whether it's about music, like they want to fit into some group, and that's what's trending right now. What are your thoughts on this explosion?
I think the problem with thinking of it in that either or approach is sort of suggesting that one is true and one is false. Right?
Okay, I don't mean to set that dichotomy. Sorry, I'm just
that's the way it gets talked about. That
right.
in the first case, when it's people coming into their own, that's the true transgender, right? That's because people are able to come out where they were not able to come out before. And in the second idea, it's because the culture is imposing these categories on us, and we're wandering into them like, billiard balls wandering into different holes, and that therefore it's not really real, and that when the next thing comes, then the more true will come out. I think, in fact, all of our identities are developed as a combination of our biological realities, our experiences, our biology changing in response to our social environments, and then our interactions with each other, the dialectics and the trialectics and all the rest of it. So we can't conclude where does this stuff come from. And really, for me, I always get back to identity pragmatism, which is to say, what's going to leave people the best off in terms of feeling good, in terms of having good, positive relationships with other people. And so for me, if those categories are enabling people to get to better places, then great, let's have them. And if they're being experienced as horrible and oppressive, well, then let's try to rework them. But it's always going to be the case that for some folks, creating more categories is going to be a positive, and for other folks, creating more categories is going to be a negative. So for people who have particular insecure identities, for example, around gender, or particular conservative beliefs, having more categories is going to make them more uncomfortable. For other people, it's going to make them more comfortable. That's just the way the social system is going to be. It's going to be this constant turmoil and constant back and forth. Hopefully, we can teach people to have less anxiety when they meet somebody who has an identity that's unfamiliar, whether that's an ethnic identity or a gender identity or whatever it is. Hopefully, we can work on that so that there's not unnecessary conflict. But I think it's always going to be the case that for some people, when there's more categories created, it's going to be a positive experience, and for other people, it's going to be a negative experience. And that has to do with our own personal psychological needs, our cultural needs, et cetera. So, is it good that there's more of these categories? For the people for whom it's good, the answer is yes. And for the people for whom experience is very anxiety provoking, it's not a positive for them, but maybe we can help them be less anxious and be less hostile, so that we don't get unnecessary conflict between individuals.
Right. Well, it's
I don't
ironic.
think gender has to scare us, right? I don't think gender needs to scare us. It scared us for many years. It doesn't need to. We can calm down about gender and sex, especially sex. We can talk without shame about sex and recognize that people don't choose what gets them off, and it's about consent and pleasure. So as long as we've got consent and pleasure, it's good. And if you want to get yourself off, you can think about whatever you want.
Right. As long as you're not hurting anyone, that's the other thing we have to put in there.
Right.
Okay. Right.
Yep. No, that's where the consent and pleasure comes
exactly.
in.
It's ironic because I didn't mean to frame it as this dichotomy of either or.
No, I know other people do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you brought into this layer of nuance, which is what I've been trying to fight for with all these talks I've had, whether in discussion with other people or my own videos, which is to try to get away from black and white thinking and try to see everything in between. And one of the things, again, is purely anecdotal from what I've seen. But when it comes to, like, when you're talking about having more categories could be bad for certain people, to me, I sometimes see that it's bad for even the people who try to fit into one of those categories, because one of the things that I'm seeing, and this is, again, it's anecdotal, there may be research on this, I haven't seen it yet, where someone who, instead of, let's say, identifying with this different category other than just male or female, it's something else, instead of identifying with that and feeling empowered and strengthened and saying, okay, this is who I am and I want to be this, and it makes me feel good. Some people, they go there almost in this, I'm in this category and therefore I'm one of the oppressed, I'm one of the vulnerable or marginalized, and that's my identity. Yeah. That's what worries me, this disempowering identity, self-identity. Yes. That's concerning. And again, I haven't fleshed out yet. I don't have any data on that, but that's what I'm seeing anecdotally and speaking to a lot of people. I know in my classes, I'm trying to get people to just stop that. If that's what you identify as, that, if that's what, as you were saying earlier, makes you feel good, but use that to elevate yourself. Okay,
well, this is one of the things I point out to people quite a lot, is that, people say, oh, gender is sort of almost like it's a natural category in the world. And I point out, well, it's not really simple that way, right? Because, as a woman wearing pants with a PhD, talking, sometimes lecturing to roomfuls of men, I couldn't have done that 100 years ago. I couldn't wear the pants. I couldn't, literally wear pants. I couldn't get a PhD, and I certainly couldn't have a position of authority and be speaking to men, telling them what they should be thinking or thinking about. So I agree with you that the attitude of, I'm a woman, therefore it's about oppression, doesn't at all recognize the way the category of woman has changed, the possibilities for women have changed, but also the ways in which categories include pleasure. And part of the reason gender has persisted throughout time is because it's pleasurable. We only talk about gender as oppressive, but I think gender clearly is pleasurable, or we wouldn't maintain it for as long as we've maintained it. That there's a pleasure to being a woman with other women, a man being with other men, being a woman in interaction with men. There's pleasure to it. And until we recognize the ways in which these categories provide us pleasure, all we do is talk about oppression. So, when people talk, for example, about why the black kids in the cafeteria all sit together, the assumption is always because they feel oppressed. But we need to start recognizing maybe it's because they're having a good time too, right? That there's ways in which those categories of oppression become places in which we develop identities that are very pleasurable. That doesn't make the oppression right, but it does mean it's not, you're right, it's not just about oppression. It does not have to categorize it. It does not have to bind us. We can recognize oppression without having to be ruled by it.
Right. And when you use pleasurable, I'm trying to think of other words to go along with pleasurable, because I want people to realize it's not just about pleasure, it's about a personal benefit. Yeah. It's adaptive.
I don't just mean sexual pleasure. I mean, it feels good. Yeah.
It feels good, it's adaptive.
That it works.
It works. It helps you function better.
Anytime that there's a category created that's a restricted category, there will necessarily be a privilege that is developed on both sides of that. And so I think we fail to really recognize the ways in which humans will be resilient and will adapt given the encouragement to do so. Not everybody will, because some people simply won't have the psychological tools to do that. But I'm glad to see the move within psychology and within social work to talking about resilience. I think that's a really great move that we've had in the last 5 years.
5? Oh yeah, I've been lecturing that in my classes for 15 years.
Finally made it into medical schools. Yay.
Hardiness and resilience.
Talking about resilience. Yes, absolutely. And fostering resilience, which is a really beautiful place to be going.
Exactly. And it's a great way to end. So thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank you. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you. And no matter what you've said, there will be people who will distort everything, and somehow you're this horrible blah, 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 blah. And so it continues. But I really appreciate being able to speak with you face to face and getting your thoughts on this. And so thank you.
Okay. All right.